What Remains of Edith Finch was a surprise hit of 2017 and is worth all the praise it received. Now that more than 7 years have passed since its release, I figured I'd take another look at it and really dissect it for all it has to offer. Though it is similar, this game isn't like mouthwashing in that it is told in mostly chronological order. Because of this, I'm going to go through the story as it is told and both tell the story of the Finches but also analyze the various scenes and imagery I can throughout it. This video will partially assume that you've already seen or played through this game, but if you haven't, you should definitely do that. If you can't play it or can't afford it, that's alright. I've provided a full, no commentary playthrough in the description below. This game is not scary, however it does deal with some pretty heavy topics. If you find any of the subject matter on screen to be disturbing in any way, you have been warned. Some context is needed before we get into the video. We are playing as Edith Finch, the likely last surviving member of her family. She is 17 years old at the time and is also 22 weeks pregnant. The entire story is told as if you were reading about her past experience with the story as a book. This is intentional, as it is framed as a way for her to pass on these stories to her child after she dies. As we'll see later, this is actually a very problematic thing to have done, but we'll get there when we get there. Anyways, Edith has metaphorically been called back to her childhood home after her mother's unfortunate passing. Her mother left her nothing but her memories, ownership of the house, and a single unmarked key. We begin the game on a boat as the entire game takes place at the non-fictional setting of Orcas Island, Washington State. Interestingly, we are facing the back of the boat, causing the perspective to seem like we are being dragged or pulled back by something despite looking away. Looking down at our lap, we can see the perspective of Edith's unnamed child. They have a cast on their arm and are holding some white flowers. These flowers are called Kaya lilies, but I don't know what they might mean. Research tells me that they might mean things like fertility and faithfulness, but I'm not entirely sure how that connects to the story. We are holding a journal signed by Edith herself as we open it to begin the story. Opening the book, we change perspectives to that of Edith in the past. This is where the main story begins, as Edith walks us through her family lineage. Edith arrives in the forest outside her home. The house is massive and MC Escher adjacent, with strange proportions and odd appendages. Inside the mailbox, there are letters and bills dated 7 years ago, which is the same year Edith's mother, Dawn, died. Continuing, Edith reveals the key her mother gave her in her will, and comments that her mother might have withheld that information to preserve some sort of mystery. This theme of real life and fantasy being muddied together is all too common throughout the story, and while Edith may feel like the passenger in this ride, we'll see all too soon that she too has a hand on the wheel. The reason Edith is returning is the same reason as her child. The family and the house's history is very mysterious, and because of that, it has a habit of reeling people in to try and tell its story. Edith comments that the woods surrounding the house have always been uncomfortably silent. I think this is showing about how the family was able to go through all the misery it did and no one seemed to care. They got a lot of attention through the so-called family curse, but none of it was in an attempt to help. It's as if they are about to say something, but never do. The family curse in question is the unfortunate circumstances surrounding each death of the family member up until then. Spectators to the house might be like, hey, isn't this a little weird that children seem to be dying here so often? Shouldn't we be doing something about that? But instead, nothing ever comes of it. Edith comments that the house made her uncomfortable as a kid, which makes a lot of sense. This entire story, I believe, is a giant metaphor for generational trauma. As a kid, you don't really recognize it, even if it's happening directly to you. The poor behavior and mistakes of your parents and other family shape who you are, for better or for worse. Edith knew something was wrong as a kid, with all the deaths happening around her, but since she was a child, didn't fully understand it. She says that now she knows that she was afraid of the house, but I don't quite think that's true. The house is scary, I don't blame her, but the house didn't kill the rest of the family. I'll get to why I think each family member's death could have been avoided, even if it's obvious during each of their sections, but for now, I'll just reiterate the title of this video. There is no curse in this game, no matter how much it tries to convince you there is. We find that the key we were given was not for the front door like one might expect. In order to get into the house, we need to climb through a doggy door in the garage. A reminder that Edith is 22 weeks pregnant, and this isn't exactly the physical state needed for actions like this. If she were to get stuck, no one would be able to find her, and she too would be taken by the house. Regardless, Edith begins her streak of putting herself in unnecessary amounts of danger and climbs in. She comments that crawling through the doggy door was easier as a kid. This makes sense to our metaphor as well. As a kid, it was easier to ignore the issues of her family due to her lack of maturity. Now, as an almost adult, she is finally coming to terms with this uncomfortable reality. She talks about how she felt oddly welcomed by the house. I think that's just how families are. They may be incredibly unhealthy for us to be and rely on, but since we're supposed to love our family unconditionally, a lot of those issues will be ignored or justified. Entering the kitchen, we can see it in relative disorder. We will see the exact events of what caused this towards the end of the game. But for now, I'll say that there was an argument between Edith's mother and great-grandmother, Edie. Edie is sort of the cornerstone of this entire story. She is what kept a lot of things going, the reason their family curse was publicized, and also responsible for many of the deaths in the family. Each generation of woman, Edie, Dawn, and Edith, showcases a different stage in a generational trauma cycle. Edie is the catalyst who, in her life experience, has unfortunately come out of it as a relatively toxic person. Dawn is the centerpiece of sorts that sees all the issues above and below in her family and wants to stop things, but is still held back by her mother, and who also attempts to just shove all the issues down instead of directly dealing with them. And Edith is the final part, left to pick up the pieces of the mess her family caused. Edith does have a grandmother, Kay, however she married into the family and is sparsely mentioned throughout the story. Edith comments that nothing in the house was necessarily wrong, but nonetheless still uncomfortable. This is another reminder that the signs and effects of generational trauma might never be fully obvious. The damage they do is small and gradual. As we move through the story, our perspective of the house goes from the relatively normal kitchen and living room to the extreme and twisted upper sections. This shows to me that while on the outside it may look fine, and it may actually be fine on a surface level, there are much deeper issues that are going ignored. Moving forward, we are faced with the first of many fates of the Finch family. Why the hell did I write that? Jesus. Edith's older brother, Milton, went missing in 2003. It is ambiguous as to whether he actually died or not, but the signs point to him actually surviving, considering his various graffiti he left around the house implying that he has since returned. Next to the front door, there is a sealed room with a peephole that, upon inspection, reveals to us as a library. Edith comments that her great-grandmother once said that every Finch was buried in the library. This is the first of many examples of how Edie didn't take the so-called family curse as seriously as she should have. Instead, she chose to sensationalize the deaths of her family members to an almost sadistic degree. We'll get into how she does this with each family member section when we get there, but importantly, Edie is the one who is responsible for publicizing their family's issues. She never took it seriously because she was kind of the catalyst for all of these issues. The family isn't actually buried in the library, but she only sees their deaths as stories to be told and attention to be gotten. All the bedrooms left of the late family members have been sealed up like the library has. Edith's mother, Dawn, was the one to do this, and it was likely in an attempt to lock their stories away from anyone else getting in. In retaliation, Edie drilled holes into each door, showcasing once again how obsessed she was with putting her family's issues on display. This memorializing is so bad that when we look into the first room, we see that Edith's grandfather, Sam, had spent his childhood in a room that had been segregated to showcase the death of his brother. It's so museumed that it literally has one of those red rope barriers keeping people from messing it up. Not only did Edie go out of her way to sensationalize these deaths, she also went great length in order to protect those stories as well. The next room is a carpeted bathroom that is labeled for what would have been Edith's uncle, who died at only a year old. Edith comments that as a kid, she just assumed that every other house was like this, which is yet another reference to how kids in these situations rarely ever really see or understand these issues when they're happening. The third room is Edie and her late husband's, Sven's. Edith says that the last time she was in that room, it was because Edie was painting her portrait. This is the kind of subtle detail that you only catch on your second or third playthrough that sends shivers down your spine. The majority of the family members have a sort of memorial plaque set up in their rooms with a painted portrait. These portraits were for dead people, and Edie was painting her great-granddaughters while she was still alive, and even worse, while she was still a kid. She was actively preparing for another death in the family and was already setting up how her story would be told. The last sealed room we see here is for Edith's great-aunt, Molly, who died when she was only 10. Across the hall, there is a room devoted to Edith's great-uncle, Walter. It isn't sealed, but this is because there isn't much to look at inside. Walter's memorial isn't here. so it doesn't need to be hidden. But in a way, this room is kind of reserved for him. Inside, there's a book laying on a window-like part of the wall. The book has a lock on it and is of the classic story 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, a story about adventure. The lock on this book is finally where we get to use the key Dawn gave us in her will. The particular choice of this book here is very fitting. It is about adventure, and unlocking this area is where our adventure officially begins. Before opening it, Edith comments that her older brother, Lewis, would tell her about secret passages in the house and that she didn't believe him. I think this is showing how Lewis, being older, was not only able to see the issues of the family, but also saw what needed to be fixed. The thing that often quote-unquote solves generational trauma is the connection between siblings. Parents, aunts, and grandparents alike all have that inherent power dynamic above children of the family, and therefore are often harder to connect with. But siblings often experience similar levels of trauma with each other, and due to that connection, are sometimes able to work to escape the issues of the family. I can attest to this. My brother and I have had many long talks about how kind of fucked up our family is. It isn't anything special or to the degree of this story, but it certainly helped us both partially escape those problems that our parents had poured onto us. And before we finally enter the story of the family, Edith says that Dawn was clearly very good at keeping secrets. She was the one to seal off the bedrooms and who spent a lot of her life attempting to get rid of all these memories. However, in doing this, she only worked to further the mystery and dodge any solutions that they could have had. And even if she wanted to hide her family's history, she still gave Edith the key, needed to unravel the story she tried so hard to silence. And so we begin our first of many recountings of how each family member died. Beginning with Molly, we poetically climb into her room through a secret passageway in the bookshelf. It's a rather blunt example of the ever-present theme of telling stories we probably shouldn't, and forcing our way into memories that are best left forgotten. Finding her notebook, we begin to unravel the story of Molly's final moments. She begins to describe how she is writing this entry so that people could remember her. Changing to her perspective, she describes how her mother, Edie, sent her to bed with no dinner. She wakes up starving and begins to scour her room for things to eat. This poor kid eats an entire tube of toothpaste, a mistletoe decoration on her bathroom window, and even her gerbil's contaminated food. After hearing a noise from the bedroom window, we see a barn swallow bird that Molly describes as going back to her nest. I'll explain why all of this is important after I describe the whole scene. In her desperation, Molly opens the window and tries to catch the bird to eat, and this is where the scene takes a very strange turn. Molly suddenly turns into a cat and begins to pursue the bird. What follows is a fantastical string of events as Molly turns into an owl after catching the barn swallow, a shark after catching the mama rabbit, and a sea monster after catching the seal. We infiltrate a ship and kill the sailors on board, before being transported back to the house. Still playing as the monster, we climb through a pipe and out the toilet in Molly's bathroom. We approach her bed, and as we prepare to attack, we become Molly once again. And finally, Molly tragically describes her thoughts in her final moments. Diving into the scene, I'm going to attempt to describe what I think it all means. A reminder that I have a habit of reading too much into things, so take everything I say with a grain of salt. As with all of my analyses, there's no way of knowing if my interpretation of the story is what the writers intended, so just bear with me here. While chasing the bird, Molly says that she tried to be quiet to get the bird. I think this is an obvious representation of that same theme of generational trauma being less than obvious. The effects of it may be awful, but you rarely ever see them in action. In Molly's case, we can see the obvious effects of Edie's terrible parenting by effectively killing her daughter through neglect. The practice of punishing children with no food likely didn't start with Edie either, but regardless, she still propagates it. She also comments about how the bird was getting more and more tired as she chased it. I think this shows the sort of hindsight effect surrounding generational trauma. We might not recognize it as it's happening, but looking back, we can see the gradual toll it took on us as we grew up. After Molly turns into the owl, she catches a normal rabbit first and then a mother one. I don't know if this was intentional, but I think this is a nod to how generational trauma does not simply travel down the family tree, but also climbs up it at times. It loops back around and often leads to things like elder abuse and neglect. While Molly is chasing the seal, she first bites off its tail and then the whole thing after chasing it down for one more time. This, to me, is both a representation of the previously mentioned gradual withering, but also is a way to picture what I think caused Edie to be like this. This whole section may be about Molly, but I think it is a massive representation of Edie's introduction into her obsession with fame. Her father dying in a relatively fantastical way planted that seed that told Edie that there was something to be gained from death. Then her own daughter died to her neglect. She began to turn that grief into a story as a coping mechanism. This snowballed over time, and before she knew it, her stories weren't just innocent ways to remember her loved ones. They were an addiction. She became a monster who devoured the rest of her family just for the satisfaction of telling these stories. Molly says it herself. Edie likely partially recognized how her actions were harming the family at the time, continuing to justify it through them being just harmless stories. She didn't want to hurt her family, but wasn't able to stop in time. Molly was just a 10-year-old kid, and in this story we can see that festering anger and resentment given to her by her mother personified, something that she was both unfortunate and fortunate enough to escape. Another interesting point that I'm throwing in here, even though I'm not sure if it's true or not, is that the boat in the end could very well be the boat that we start the game on. It has cars and a full cafeteria, which heavily implies to me that it's a ferry, which is needed to get from the mainland Washington to Orcas Island. If this is the case, I think this teases the fact that Edie's stories eventually escaped the confines of the house, bleeding out into the world and causing the fame she gained from it to further her addiction even more. The last passenger of the ship we kill is the driver, a rather obvious metaphor of how this will eventually come back to bite Edie. Continuing this idea of showing Edie's addiction through Molly's eyes, the final thing she hunts is Molly herself. At first, her stories started as just that, fantastical tales of monsters and men. But eventually, whether she realized it or not, the main character of those stories became her family. Molly recognized this. She says at the end of her scene that she thinks the monster is waiting for her to fall asleep, but it isn't going to wait much longer. At first, Edie didn't write her stories until after her family members died. But as we saw with painting Edith's portrait, she began to anticipate it and, in a way, even cause those deaths to further her own addiction. Edith continues her exploration of the house by climbing out onto the awning? Pregnancy or not, don't fucking do this. Edith's reckless abandon is almost a direct tell of how she's, in a way, Edie too. She's going through all this trauma and is basically showing us that this curse is going to get her too, even if Edie isn't there to ensure it. Edith states how her mom tried to defend her children from Edie's stories, but despite that, still helped further them through little things like naming their cat after Molly. I think this shows how, no matter how much we think we have grown past the trauma our parents dumped on us, there are still often parts that bleed through. Something about the phenomenon of we won't fuck our children up as much as our parents did, that in turn results in a whole new kind of fucked up. Edith comments that she spent a lot of time in Edie's room and how it was a place they could hide from her mom. This is simply manipulation in my eyes. Edie turned Edith against Dawn because Dawn didn't play along with her fantasies. She couldn't get to Dawn, so she went to her daughter instead. In the corner of the room, we can find an unfinished portrait of Edith's older brother, Louis. Edith comments that Louis died only a week before her and Mom left the house, but Edie had already started to memorialize him. I think this was the last straw for Dawn. She lost a second child to Edie and the house and couldn't lose a third, so she finally did what she should have a long time ago. All the family members died in or around the house, so escaping it was really their only option. A rather chilling detail in Edie's room is the many now empty bird cages. She only had so many family members, so I'm sure that the many pets of the family weren't safe from her fantastical wrath either. I'm not a bird expert, but I'm pretty sure a few of these birds are finches. How fitting. A poster on the wall describes her endless search for attention. Edie gave an interview about a mole man living under the house. Dawn was furious about this, and we'll see exactly why later. Her entire room is full of tiny bits of attention she got over the years. The Mole Man story, a forest fire that she refused to evacuate the island for, and the story of her own husband's death. Given he married into the family, Sven doesn't get a section about his death. However, what we do know is that he died after a dragon-shaped slide he was building collapsed. Edie would tell people that he died to a dragon. The instant trivialization of things like this are what really made Edie a monster. She might think that her stories are honoring the person they're about, but in reality they are inaccurate representations of who they really were. Sven could have been known for his carpentry or construction skills, but instead Edie made up a story about him. Don't worry though, this is far from her worst offense. Edith comments that despite her age, Edie often seemed a lot younger than Dawn, or more accurately, less mature. Finally, in Edie's room, we find a memorial for her father, Odin. A picture reel describes to us both the surface-level history of the family, but also the circumstances of Odin's death. Odin lived a very fantastical life. The family curse apparently existed before Edie, taking Edie's mother and newborn brother before Odin left in an attempt to escape the curse. To do this, he turned his entire house into a boat, which was destroyed on the voyage, killing him. I think the irony of attempting to escape the curse, while actively bringing it with you in the form of the house, is more than evident here. Edie is at fault for all she did following this, but I think it is her father's fantastical death that is what really set things into motion. Edie, her husband, and Molly all survive the crash and begin to build a home on the island, but not before building the cemetery for Odin. Building the cemetery before the house is oddly fitting. It aligns with the whole preparing for their deaths before they die thing. We find out later that despite Sven building the house, Edie was the one to build the graveyard. Shocking, I know. The reel ends by saying that Edie was already dreaming of a new Finch house, already dreaming of continuing the curse. I'll get into which deaths I think were actually caused by Edie and which weren't, and how they all affected the story at the end of this video, but I think Odin's was the sort of inciting incident for Edie's addiction. This reel obviously wasn't made by her, but the fact that her trauma could be publicized got to her nonetheless. We continue into the tacky pink bathroom we caught a glimpse of earlier. We find out that despite not being a huge part of the family, this bathroom was made by Edith's grandmother, Kay. She comments that it's a pretty big mark to leave, and we'll see exactly why later. Above the toilet, a book sits on a suspiciously shaped shelf on the wall. Opening it, we see a short story with Sven and his two sons, Sam and Calvin. Unfortunately, I feel like I'm missing something here, as I can't really understand what this is supposed to mean. I think it's important that in this story, Calvin is the one to find the secret, and as we'll find out in a bit, is the first of the brothers to die. Other than that though, I have no idea, so if you guys have any thoughts about what this might mean, be sure to let me know about that in the comments below. Opening the book reveals another hidden passageway. This one is a makeshift dark room that Edith's grandfather, Sam, would frequent. We find out later that Sam was a bit obsessed with photography. Whether this was just a surface level characterization or a result of Edie's influence, I'm not sure. Continuing, we enter into Sam and Calvin's split room. On Calvin's side, we have to remove the red museum rope to explore it, finding out that Sam never really talked about Calvin, choosing to move on rather than to memorialize him. This makes what we find up here all that more interesting. In the loft, we find Calvin's memorial, an astronaut helmet with a piece of paper inside it. Inspecting it, we find a poem that Sam supposedly wrote for his brother. I'll get into why I find this suspicious after I explain its contents. Calvin's story is short. Sam describes how one day after their older sister's funeral, Calvin went out to the tree swing next to their house. Edie calls them inside for dinner, and Sam leaves to heed her call. As Sam laments his grief, Calvin swings higher and higher, trying to go in a full circle in the swing, which ultimately results in him being thrown off the cliff. What's also interesting here is the dichotomy of the twins and how, even as children, Calvin was rebellious to his mother and Sam was obedient. Sam instantly listens to his mother when she calls him, but Calvin ignores it. Sam comments that he told Calvin that going around was impossible. He's talking literally about the swing, but I think he's actually referring to his own melancholy nature and how they couldn't escape Edie. Sam played along with everything Edie wanted. We'll get to it later, but Sam's death was completely separated from Edie and one of the few that wasn't at the house. I think this is because of the same obedience that allowed him to live as long as he did. A sad aspect of this scene is that we never hear Calvin talk. His story is told entirely through Sam, and I think that shows how Calvin's desire for something beyond the house caused a bit of resentment in Edie. He didn't play along, and so his story was written too. too. Calvin and Molly both show a new theme of neglect throughout this family. A lot of the deaths are not caused directly by Edie or anyone else, but instead are a result of the child being left alone when they shouldn't have been. Molly starved to death in a house full of food due to her fear of standing up to Edie, and Calvin was allowed to play on this massive swing while recovering from a broken foot. I'm not going to say that Edie killed him, but who builds a swing set that close to a cliff? Finding another passage, we continue to the next of Edie's children's rooms, Barbara. Barbara was a child movie star known for her role in a movie about Bigfoot. Barbara was famous, but as she grew up, the fame dwindled and she started to be forgotten. Edith comments here that as a kid, she knew Barbara as a child star, but I think that's just because that's exactly what Edie wanted. We'll see in a bit, but Edie's obsession with Barbara's fame is honestly terrifying. Barbara's story is told to us in a magazine comic of all places, and is interestingly not written by Edie. As with all of these sections, I'm going to describe what happens and then talk about what I think it all means. Opening the comic, we find a mysterious, ghoulish narrator called Old Jack, a man with a pumpkin for a head. He describes Barbara's fall from glory and how she got a lucky break in the form of a movie convention. She was famous for her scream, and all she had to do was showcase that again. But now, as a 16-year-old, her voice aged with her, and it just wasn't the same. It shows us how her boyfriend and quote-unquote biggest fan, Rick, would critique her scream. They are interrupted when Sven is heard cutting his hand open with a table saw downstairs. Edie and Sven both leave to the emergency room, meaning Barbara had to babysit her younger brother, Walter, and in turn missed out on the convention. Her douchebag boyfriend continues to critique her. They are interrupted once again by a news report from the radio that tells them about a gang of masked hoodlums terrorizing the island and a loud crash noise from the basement. Leaving to investigate, they find the basement door is locked and that the key is hidden in the music box next to it. Rick takes the key and ventures down into the basement, but doesn't return for some time, prompting Barbara to go after him. Entering the basement, we find Rick's crutch and a trail of blood through the basement that we follow. The radio pipes up again, telling us that the leader of the previously mentioned gang is known as the Hookman Killer, who apparently had killed and ate his family 10 years ago to the day. We also find that the trail of blood wasn't Rick's and instead Sven's from the table saw accident. Continuing, we find a fridge that is rattling back and forth, and approaching it, we find Rick jumping out at us in an attempt to scare us. Barbara hits him with the crutch and kicks him out of the house, keeping the crutch. She falls asleep on the couch before being woken by Walter screaming her name. Going up to his room, he's nowhere to be found, with another radio in his place. The radio describes the killer as he suddenly appears behind her in the door. After grappling him with the crutch, Barbara kicks him out of the room and locks the door as he attempts to break in. Barbara uses the secret passageway into Molly's room to flank the killer. She hits him with the crutch and he falls off the banister after tripping over one of her roller skates. He appears to have been knocked out by the fall, but after descending the stairs to check on him, he has disappeared. Suddenly, the doorbell rings, and going to open it, we are surprised by a bunch of people in monster costumes inside the house. The monsters are revealed to not be people in costumes, but real monsters, as they swarm her, and she lets out one final big screen-worthy scream. The story ends by telling us that the entire event was blamed on Rick, who also vanished that night, his crutch being found outside, and that Walter had been hiding under the bed the whole time. Apparently, all that was left of Barbara was her ear, hidden in the same music box from earlier. That was a lot. And trust me, my explanation is going to be even more complicated. I believe that Barbara's entire story is a lie. To some of you, this may be obvious. She obviously wasn't eaten by monsters because that isn't real. But I mean the entire situation. To me, one of three events actually happened. First is that, being famous, Barbara attracted an obsessed fan who murdered her one night. This very well may have been the same boyfriend, as there's the classic trope of the boyfriend leaving and the killer entering. The second and least likely option is that Edie actually killed Barbara in order to get every last drop of fame she could from her. I don't think this holds a lot of weight, but I do think it's possible due to the fact that the Hookman Killer is described as murdering and eating his family, which in a way is exactly exactly what Edie is doing. She's gobbling up all the attention she gets from the deaths in her family, and she's obsessed with it. I think Barbara's death is where Edie's addiction was at its peak, and it really shows. Barbara's story is the most detached from the family, and Edie was likely angered when Barbara lost her fame over time, making the aftermath all that more extreme. The third option is the one I think is the most likely, and that is that Barbara wasn't murdered, but instead died by falling through the banister. The banister is known to be a real part of the story because it is broken in real life, as Edith explores the house. However, I don't think that any of the rest of the story is true. Here's what I think actually happened. Sven cuts his hand open and is rushed to the emergency room by Edie, and Barbara is left at home with Rick and Walter. Rick attempts to scare her into getting her scream back, but it doesn't work and Barbara kicks him out. Later, Walter calls out to her due to a nightmare after listening to the radio broadcast. On the way up to his room, Barbara trips on one of her skates and falls through the banister, dying. Edie and Sven come home to find Barbara dead on the floor and Walter hiding under his bed, forever traumatized. And instead of dealing with this like a normal person would by telling the truth, Edie decides to tell all of Barbara's remaining fans this fantastical tale of how she was murdered. I know this all sounds a bit conspiratorial, but I think it's possible. Walter's room has a perfect view of that part of the banister that Barbara fell through, so he would have seen it happen. If the killer's story were real, the door would have been closed and he wouldn't have seen any of it. Maybe hearing it would have been enough, but I'm not so sure. Also, it's incredibly suspicious that in the comic's course of events, the killer miraculously disappears without us hearing him, which is incredibly unlikely. It all just seems very convenient and tailored to be this fantastical tale to the point where it's honestly ridiculous. Hell, I'm not even sure Rick even existed. His disappearance is very convenient, and the existence of the crutch left by him could very well be attributed to Calvin instead, as we don't know how much time was between when Barbara died and when Calvin broke his leg. Since Calvin died 1 year after Barbara, I think it's entirely possible that this crutch could be his and not Rick's. Another reason I don't think Rick even existed, or that his existence was greatly exaggerated, is that after he supposedly takes the key to enter the basement and Barbara pursues him, we have to retrieve the key again ourselves, which wouldn't make any sense. I could be entirely wrong about this scene, but ultimately I don't think it really matters. What matters is that the story is told to us by an unreliable narrator, and that the truth of how Barbara actually died is completely hidden by this curtain of fame Edie tried so hard to keep up. I think that the reality of Barbara losing her fame, which Edie was most certainly profiting off of, was what made this story so strange, as Edie couldn't handle the idea of losing attention like that. I am reiterating the point of Edie being at the peak of her addiction here. I think that Barbara's death, combined with the grief of Molly's and the fantasy around Odin's, culminated into her making the stories of her family a museum experience when they should have just been left to the family graveyard. Edith says it herself. Despite Barbara's death being a tragedy, Edie likely saw a happy ending. As with all of these sections, please let me know what your interpretation of the events are in the comments down below. I think this section is the least concrete of them all, so I'd love to hear what you think of it. As we leave Barbara's room to go investigate the basement, now that we know about the key, Edith comments that despite playing with the music box a lot as a kid, she never found the key. I think this is yet another reference to how Edith kind of takes this all at face value, and how she believed everything Edie told her. After following the hint we saw in the comic, and thankfully not finding a human ear in the music box, we enter into the basement. We soon find the fridge, and upon opening it, we find a hidden vault below the house. Edith comments that she never found out what happened to her great-uncle Walter, and that her mom told her that he ran away. In reality, Walter was living under the house the whole time, hiding from something we know all too well at this point. We find his memorial and read his story. Walter describes how he had been in the vault for 30 years, and that one day the house started shaking at the same time every day. To cope, he created a routine, a monotonous cycle of music on the radio and peaches for every meal. To fight his depression, he chose to treat every day like it was his last, expecting the monster outside his door to kill him at any second. He talks about how it started to feel normal, that this practice of desperation became the norm, and he learned to be comfortable with it. This horrifying existence continued one day, until it stopped. The monster got tired of waiting and moved on. Or maybe he just got tired of being afraid. But soon he started running out of food, so he finally takes a stand. Turning to our left, we find a hatch in the floor that Walter climbs down into some tunnels below. He says that he knows the monster's out there, the same monster that killed his siblings. Grabbing a sledgehammer, Walter begins to break his way out of the tunnels as he talks about how he just needed a change, even if it killed him. We exit the tunnels onto some train tracks as Walter describes how he doesn't care if he only has so much as a single day left to live. He's going to live life to its fullest. It's a shame that couldn't happen. Walter's story is one of the most tragic to me because it's one of the most real. Obviously, hiding out in a vault for 30 years is ridiculous, but paranoia, trauma, and fear are all very real reactions to generational trauma. If it wasn't obvious, the monster in the story is Edie, and the thing Walter's so scared of is her getting to him. Walter lived for a lot longer than the rest of his siblings, and that's simply because Edie had other toys to play with in the form of her children and grandchildren. But over time, as she slowly ran out of family members to fulfill her obsession, she began trying to get to Walter. First, it was little things like talking about the mole man beneath the house to the press, but soon it became desperate things like no longer bringing him food or information about the family. Walter mentions that he knows the monster's out there and that it took his siblings, but he doesn't mention Sam's name despite Sam dying before he did. I think this shows how forgotten he was, and this wasn't entirely Edie's fault. Dawn helped with this torture by not trying to help Walter. It's possible she didn't know he was down there, but it's unlikely. Dawn clearly wants to change things and to stop her grandmother, but she never ends up doing anything about it until it's too late. She only left the house after Edie had taken both of her sons. Walter's story is incredibly poetic too. Instead of exiting the bunker via the door like a normal person would, he climbs through a hidden exit and breaks out through one of the tunnel walls. He tried to go around, but just like Calvin, the instant he got away, Edie got him too. On the way out, following Walter's steps, Edith comments that she doesn't want to make the same mistakes that her mom did, trying to bury something that's still alive. But instead of doing what she needs to do, killing the family legacy and leaving it behind, she continues to propagate it by writing this book. She even says it herself. Maybe we believed so much in a family curse that we tried to make it real. Exiting the tunnel, we see that Walter's death wasn't what it seemed. The train tracks are interrupted by the edge of the island, weathering that didn't happen recently. I think Walter took his own life by throwing himself off the cliff, and Edie took advantage of it as quickly as she could. I mean, who watches their own son die and then memorializes the train that did it? I want to end this section by talking about how each of the older members of the family ended up dealing with the trauma. Sam went along with whatever Edie wanted. Dawn tried to fight against it without actually doing anything, and Walter fell into a deep depression as he attempted to hide from it. None of them were viable options. We continue down the coast as Edith laments that she's unsure if she should even be writing this book. She contemplates whether it's worth it or not to tell these stories, if it was these same stories that resulted in the deaths of her family. Interestingly, Edith says that she thinks the people in these stories believed them, but this is a blatant misunderstanding of her situation. Of course it feels that way. That's exactly how Edie would have wanted it. She wrote all the stories to seem like they were unavoidable accidents, miserable moments that needed to be remembered. But in reality, it was those stories that made death feel less permanent to the rest of the family. We'll talk about it more in depth later, but the entire family has this habit of throwing caution to the wind, especially Edith with her climbing into and onto places she shouldn't be as a pregnant woman. Edith continues to talk about how strange this family was, and how from an outsider's perspective, it was just a series of unfortunate events. She comments that it's silly for the family to finish building the cemetery before the house, and that she was more uncomfortable around the pet cemetery than the human one. She is stating the entire issue of what we've been talking about with her, and yet she refuses to stop what she's doing. She justifies it by claiming that it's just to pass on the stories to her child, even though she knows nothing good will come from this. Finding the family cemetery, we can see the continued desecration of her family's image in how Edie propped them all up. The designs on each of them don't memorialize who they were, they memorialize how they died. It's almost like she's mocking them. What I have to ask though is, if Edie was the one to build the cemetery, who was the one to build her grave? Looking out into the sea, we can see the old house still laying there, calling to Edith as its bell still rings. I don't think this is really happening. I think the house might be there, but I don't think the bell is real. I think it is a representation of how Edie molded Edith to be the one to carry on the stories after she died, and it worked flawlessly. Edith returns to the house, and after her craziest stunt yet, comments that if she knew there'd be so much climbing, then she wouldn't have done all this. But she doesn't have to do any of this. She could have turned around when the door was locked. She could have left it all behind, let some billionaire take it and turn it into a museum or something. But instead, she scours through it herself, risking her and her child's life along the way. Climbing onto the roof of the garage, we reach the porch of Sam's roof that we previously couldn't access due to the locked door. Edith comments that she never met her grandfather, but that he and her mother likely had a lot in common. They were both just trying to protect their kids, even if neither of them went about it on the right way. Where Dawn attempted to just shut the family history out and protect her children, Sam attempted to strengthen his kids to know better than to fall for Edie's obsession. After watching past Socks struggle to walk around a table, we enter Sam's room to find out about him and his family. As we saw before, Sam was a photographer who loved his hobby. Despite this, Edith comments how he was always nervous in front of the camera. I think this shows about how he was sort of a bystander to his mother's actions. He watched all of her stories get written and, as we'll see in a bit, even helped write one himself. But he knew that he'd be in his own story, one way or another. Sam's theme of being a bystander to the family curse is shown again as we find out that he was a war veteran. Sam's story is told through a series of photos he took on a hunting trip with Dawn. Dawn comments that she doesn't want to shoot anything while they're out there. As we continue through their story, we watch as Dawn takes some photos of her own. Sam tells her to be careful since the camera is older than she is. It's interesting that he cares more about the camera than his own daughter. This camera is also pretty obviously a reference to Edie and how Sam enabled her actions throughout his life. Sam teaches Dawn how to fish and describes it as stuff she needs to do to survive. You don't have to hunt to survive, but Sam sure thinks you do. We move to a scene with Dawn holding a rifle and aiming at a deer in the distance. To help her take the shot, Sam gets behind her to help her aim. He says that she'll need to be able to do stuff like this if she wants to survive. Again, not necessary at all. Sam sets up the camera and goes to meet Dawn, who is crying over the deer he made her shoot. Posing with the deer, Sam tells Dawn to focus on the camera instead of the deer, to look at the stories and not the death. And then suddenly, the deer gets up and knocks Sam off the cliff, killing him. Sam symbolizes one of the many reactions to generational trauma, and that is compliance. Instead of hiding from it or attempting to change the misery passed down by Edie, he propagates it. I think he genuinely thought that the stories were completely innocent. And while he did try to teach his children how to survive, it didn't work out because he wasn't able to protect himself. Hell, Edie didn't even have to do any work for his death. He literally took the photos for her. In a way, Sam was just a tool for Edie to have an easier time writing her stories. As she aged and lost more family members, she needed someone else to take photos and supply more children. First it was Sam, then Dawn, and now Edith, whose apparent sole purpose is to make Edie's obsession easier, no matter how they actually thought of it. We exit Sam's room into another crawl space and find ourselves in a shared room for Dawn and her brothers, Gregory and Gus. Walking up to Gregory's crib, we find out that he died at only 1 year old. But interestingly, Edie had nothing to do with his death. His story is told through divorce papers from Sam to his ex-wife, Kay, the one who made the pink bathroom from earlier. Speaking of the bathroom, we're transported into Gregory's point of view as he sits in the bathtub, playing with his toys. The voiceover from Sam asks Kay if she could remember how Gregory used to laugh at nothing, like something was funny but only he could see it. Kay opens the shower and goes to take Gregory out of the tub, but is interrupted by a phone call. Kay leaves to go take the call, and closes the shower door behind her. Kay and Sam begin to argue over the phone as Gregory resumes his playtime. Suddenly, the toys begin to spring to life and Gregory plays with them. Sam comments how Gregory reminded him of Calvin in his imagination, that he wishes he could see what Gregory saw. Pulling more toys into the water, it begins to get displaced, slowly rising. Continuing to bounce around with the toy frog, we knock a bottle of shampoo into the tub, which begins to spill into the water. Sam says that it might have been ridiculous that he worried too much about his baby being too happy, but he talks about it like you'd talk about someone who's on their deathbed. He could feel Gregory slipping away, becoming less in tune with reality, despite being just a baby. Kay returns and pulls the plug on the tub, draining it as Sam comments that she did everything she could. He blames himself for calling that night and for distracting her. From what? Well, from Gregory starting the water in the tub as Kay shuts the door to answer another call. As Gregory's horrifying experience unfolds and we exit reality into Gregory's imagination, Sam continues. He reiterates that he doesn't blame Kay for Gregory's death. Sam talks about how he thinks Gregory is happier now and that he'd want Kay to be happy too. In his imagination, Gregory pulls the plug of the bathtub and swims right down into it, ending the scene. Interestingly, Edith has nothing to say after reading this. I think this is showing how Edie probably thought of it too. The story practically wrote itself, and all Edie did was set up his memorial with, yet again, the things that ended up killing him. Gregory's death was the greatest example of the previously mentioned lack of caution in the family. Kay might not have been a part of the bloodline, but being in that house still made her incredibly unsafe in her actions. Closing the shower door on a baby in the tub is a terrible thing to do, and leaving the room to answer a phone call so that that baby who doesn't understand English yet didn't have to hear it is also ridiculous. Though all of these deaths were unwarranted, I believe Gregory's is the greatest example of how most of these deaths could have been avoided if only the family didn't believe in the curse. In that same room, we can also find Sam's second son, Gus's memorial. I gotta stop with the alliteration in the script, holy cow. Gus's story is told through a poem written on a kite spool. This poem, which is apparently written by a then 14-year-old Dawn. She talks about how Sam would never hit them, but did once when Gus said that he'd die before he saw a wedding in their yard. Sam forced him to come, but Gus stood aside and chose to fly his kite instead of joining the festivities. This wedding was between Sam and an unidentified stepmother who Gus resents, as most kids often do. In his delinquency, Gus stayed ignoring the event even after Sam calls him for photos. Interestingly, Sam seems to ignore Gus after this moment. Suddenly, a storm picks up, and all the wedding guests take shelter in a tent. Everyone except Gus, who continues to fly his kite. Through Edith's narration, Dawn describes that despite the awful storm, no one thought the tent they were in would collapse. A fairly obvious representation of how the family saw all these terrible things happening, but never really expected it would happen to them. In reaction to the rising storm, Sam simply turned up the music inside the tent, leaving Gus to be ignored even harder. Dawn says that she wishes she could say that she thought about Gus that day, but in reality, no one thought about him until they found his body, crushed by the tent as it was lifted off the ground. Gus is an example of the phenomenon of the forgotten child, the kid who gets set aside for any amount of reasons, whether it be attention to their siblings, work, or otherwise. It's not his fault that he was disrespectful. Every 13-year-old is at some point, but this disrespect made it so that his family forgot about him. He even had no input in how his death was told, rubbing more salt into that wound. Gus died and people thought whatever they wanted about him, and then they moved on. He didn't have a room of his own, or much personal space to begin with. He simply got swept up in the chaos of the non-existent family curse, just another story to be told. We move into the loft of the trio's room, finding a list of things each child had to do every day, showing us how Sam made his children live a very strict life. The loft requires even more unnecessary climbing by Edith as we scale a rock wall and find Dawn's teenage hideout where she'd spend most of her days. We find out about how Dawn was an English teacher in India, which is where she met Edith's father, Sanjay. At some arbitrary time after Edith was born, Sanjay died to an unknown cause, and Dawn, having no other options, returned to the house on Orcas Island. As she scales the roof, Edith comments that the house had to get a little bigger to accommodate Dawn and her children. But it didn't have to get bigger. It only did because Edie was reserving the rest of the house for her memorials that she could have gotten rid of. Edith comments that for a while things were normal, but it didn't last. The beginning of the end was when, for his 10th birthday, Edie built Milton a castle. In Milton's room, we can find every kid's dream room, with a space away from his parents and a massive skylight above it. Milton was an artist, and at his desk, we can find a short flip book called The Magic Paintbrush. It is a short, wordless animation where Milton is seen drawing a cartoon until it magically comes to life. With this realization, Milton creates a flipbook within the flipbook that shows him painting the false door we can find below us, and leaving with a bow. As we know, Milton likely didn't actually die. He simply ran away. I think Milton shows us what is sometimes the only real way to escape these things: to leave it all behind. Due to his various graffiti around the house, we can see that he'd been back sometime in the past, but it's unclear if anything came of it. At least for the first few stories, Milton's graffiti can be found right before entering each kid's room. I think this is sort of a way to tell Edith, hey, I stepped out and left the family, and I'm still alive. Nothing comes from the answers you'll find. Maybe I'm looking too much into it, but it still seems interesting that his graffiti is right outside the beginning of each story. Edith describes the construction of Milton's castle as the beginning of the end, because this allowed Milton to get a glimpse of freedom. He had space and time to think, and it allowed him to get his head straight, to make the right decision of leaving everything behind. Milton's actions of making the false door show that he had to build his own escape from the family. He was never going to get that through the family, and he recognized that the rest of them were likely beyond repair. I don't think him leaving was a selfish act, but instead the most rational one he could have made. As she leaves the castle, Edith comments that whatever Milton found in the house, Dawn didn't want it getting out, and that despite looking for him for some time, she sealed the doors after Milton went missing. I think Milton supposedly being taken by the house was a sort of reality check for Dawn, a situation of, it happened to all my family members, but it would never happen to me. Right? Sealing the doors was the first time she actively ever took a step to stop all this from happening, but she was at fault due to her inaction leading up to that point and lack of ability to leave after Edie drilled the peepholes. We leave the castle and ascend even higher up the house to our penultimate family story. Edith talks about how after Milton's disappearance, Dawn blamed Edie for it, rightfully so. But Lewis blamed himself. Lewis was older and had the authority to change things, too, to be there for his brother, but he wasn't, and for that, he thinks it was all his fault. Lewis reacted to this in a similar way to Walter, hiding away in his room to try and simply avoid the abuse, all while actively living in it. Lewis doesn't have a memorial, his drug trip of a room being more than enough. Instead, we find out about his death through a letter from Lewis's therapist to Dawn. She describes how they began looking into the treatment for Lewis's substance abuse. She talks about how Lewis slowly became more and more disinterested in his life. He became dull and only continued because he had to. At his job, we are shown how he coped with this depression, using his vivid imagination to imagine himself in a video game adjacent story. His imagination started simple, but slowly became more complex with time. She talks about how this was important to him, and how she hoped it would result in him finding himself, but that he found something more. The imaginary game switches from simple 2D to an isometric view. The therapist recalls that she talked to Lewis's boss at the cannery about this daydreaming, which could potentially be dangerous around the equipment. Nothing came of it, though, as Lewis's boss described him as a model employee. His daydreaming allowed him to turn into somewhat of a machine. Moving forward, Lewis's imagination grows, taking up more of the screen. This cleverly made sequence is really interesting, as you have to both focus on moving in the game while you are also working at the cannery. It does a great job of subtly mentioning how he'd eventually lose himself to this game. The therapist describes how in his imagination, Lewis made friends and created a city. He made citizens for that city, musicians out of those citizens, and songs for them to play. His imagination grew by the day until he no longer spoke to his coworkers at the cannery. His imaginary self got even more complex as he learned how to control it, but he continued to deteriorate in the real world, getting more lost in his thoughts over time until one day he forgot to go home from the cannery. We see Dawn try to get through to him, but it's helpless. He imagines himself searching for love and conquering cities. In search of a prince or princess, he finds himself at a new castle. The entire screen except the fish is now his imagination. Lewis was so proud of creating this world that he almost fully moved into it. It was easier and more interesting there, so why wouldn't he? He decided that the real Lewis was the one in his imagination, not the one cutting the fish. And he lost himself completely. Entering the palace doors, we briefly return to the real world, but we aren't playing as Lewis. Whether it be Dawn or simply a symbolization of Lewis as a spectator to his real life, we find him, still at the cannery, but this time he isn't cutting anything. The therapist describes how the realization about who the real Lewis was slowly turned into resentment for himself. He wanted to be in his imagination forever, and the real Lewis was in his way. We return to the palace. We are thrust into a scene of wonder as Lewis moves to be crowned king. Included in the crowd, there is a large cat with a name tag that says Molly on it, and is described as his guide in this world. There was only one thing left to do: bend down his head and receive his crown. Lewis's story is one of the most memorable in this game. He was a similar story to that of Walter and Milton, but instead of attempting to escape, he simply fell apart at the seams as this misery of the family withered him away. We don't know how he died exactly, but I think it was either an accident at the cannery or self-inflicted. Whatever it was, being guided by Molly was very symbolic. She was the first victim of Edie's, and he was the last. How fitting that she be the one to wrap his story up. Lewis's story is more complex than I care to admit. There's a lot to talk about here, and there's just so much symbolism that my brain kind of short-circuits when confronting it. As with everything, I'm gonna throw in another reminder here to comment down below about your ideas about this story, because it's always fun to hear other people's understanding of it. After Lewis's funeral is when Dawn finally made the decision she should have a while ago. Her and Edith packed and planned to leave, not telling Edie until the last minute that they were really leaving her behind. Edith says that she wishes she stayed at the house, really putting that ignorance on full display. I shouldn't be too critical of her, she's only 17, but still, some reflection would have gone a long way here. Edith enters the final room of the house, her room at the very top. Edith climbs into her bed and begins to write about the events of that final night. She describes how Edie was silent the whole day until dinner, when she and Dawn got into an argument. Edie says that she isn't leaving and that Edith is excused from the table to avoid the argument. Edith goes to find a gift that Edie had left for her. The power was out, but Edie had left candles everywhere, showing how she would always find a way to keep her stories alive, even in the dark. We climb through a second entrance to the sealed library as Dawn and Edie's argument can be heard through the walls. Edie explains that the curse won't stop once they leave and that Edith has a right to know the stories. Dawn says what we're all thinking.
My children are dead because of your stories!
Edie's gift was, shockingly, another story found at her desk in the library. After Past Socks messes up the controls and opens the books twice, we begin to read Edie's final story. Edie begins by explaining the events of the night Edith was born. She described how the tide was unusually low that day, allowing her to walk to the old house. She had seen that house every single day and never thought she'd actually ever return to it. Suddenly, fog rolled over the shore and she briefly got lost. Following a deer, she finds herself back at the house, describing that she didn't know if it was the house calling to her or if she was seeking it out. Edie's story is interrupted by Dawn finding her and attempting to take the book away. In their struggle, the book is ripped in half, Edith keeping the side that still had the story on it. Dawn dragged Edith to the car, and they left early that night. The van they ordered from the nursing home came the next day, but Edie was nowhere to be found. Edith continues, describing the aftermath of that night. Her and her mother moved around a lot and survived for about half a decade longer until she got sick. She tried to deny it, but it caught up to her eventually. Edith was the last Finch left until she found out about her pregnancy. She says that she doesn't know how to move forward, but that she thinks that they should just try to appreciate the stories for what they are. She says that she hopes her kid will never have to read this book, and that she wishes she could tell them the stories herself. But unfortunately, the book was only given to them in the event of Edith's death, which happened sometime off-screen. Crawling through a womb, surrounded by the letters that made up all the rest of the story, the Finch curse is born once again. We return to the beginning of the game where we see Edith's child, now grown a little bit, sitting over her grave, her dying the same year they were born. And so ends the story of What Remains of Edith Finch. This game was truly beautiful, and I'm excited to check out what the rest of What Annapurna Interactive have to offer. The game was also very complex, and between the interest of getting this out and my own sanity, I definitely missed some things within it, and I think I'm okay with that. Like with mouthwashing, I was never going to understand every single aspect of this story. I offer you to fill in the blanks I missed, and tell me about all of your thoughts around the story in the comments below. For now though, I want to throw in one last bit about the story that I think is fairly important. I want to briefly summarize each character's death and how they relate to Edie, if at all, and why most of them could have been avoided. Odin's death obviously couldn't have been avoided, but it is what caused Edie to be so interested in death and the stories surrounding it. His death was like that of a fairy tale. Being swept up in the waves on a boat made of his house is quite the way to go, and it likely fascinated her. Molly's death was what created the spark for Edie's grief. It was entirely her fault for neglecting her child, and it began the downward spiral of seeking out the stories to fulfill her grief. Sven's death was the beginning of Edie's entrance entrance into fame. She learned that she could get attention from the stories she made about her family's death, and so she started small. Calvin was next, and is where the stories truly became official. Her family's deaths became art projects, an entry in a book, and soon they would become an addiction. Barbara's death was surrounded by attention due to her fame, and it's certain that a lot of the attention was directed at Edie. Edie was suddenly hit with this massive dopamine boost from the death of a family member, and officially became obsessed with it. She wrote stories, commanded publications, and spoke to the press all about this business that should have been personal, and she was consumed by it. No one died for a while after Barbara, and this allowed the family to briefly recover. Her son, Sam, had 3 children, and all seemed to be going well until the so-called curse struck up again with Gregory. Edie wasn't involved with this death at all, but I think it threw her back into her addiction, because it was after all this that she went right back into writing her stories. Gus's death may have been largely forgotten by his immediate family, but I think Edie latched onto it as much as she could, designing his memorial in a crude and disrespectful way, much like she had everybody else. With Sam dying in a literally picture-perfect way a year later, it's like her obsession became automated. Her manufacturing of the fake family curse resulted in a family that was reckless and broken, and now all she had to do was sit back and watch. After Sam died, there was another significant break in deaths as Dawn grew up and had 3 children. I think this largely happened because the only one left in the house, while Dawn was in India, was Walter, and he had locked himself away. After Dawn and her family returned to the house due to Sanjay's death, Edie's obsession was increased just a little bit more, as she had more people at her disposal once again. She gave Milton a castle where he could go hide from Dawn and become an artist just like her. I don't think she expected him to go missing, but I don't think she minded it either. Hell, he even made his own memorial in the form of the flipbook. I think it was around this time where Edie began tormenting Walter. Whether intentional or not, her constant presence over him aided him until he walked right into her arms, even if he thought he was going around. I don't know if she stopped supplying him food, but it's entirely possible that she simply got tired of waiting for him to die. It got to him eventually, and he attempted to escape, but either due to Edie or by his own doing, he barely made it 50 yards. This was the time where Dawn finally, at least partially, came to her senses and retaliated against Edie. This happened earlier, but Dawn sealing the doors was her attempt to sort of shut Edie up for once, to leave it all behind and forget about it. But Edie, still obsessed, just took this as another opportunity to turn her family into a museum. Dawn isn't innocent. In a way, her sealing of the rooms was a way of preserving the past when she should have destroyed it and left. Louis, being surrounded by death and haunted by the loss of his brother, began to lose himself. The family curse withered away at all of them, but it was most obvious with Louis. Edie's death was her last hurrah of sorts. It was time for her story to be written, and of course, she was going to be the one to write it. She manufactured this whole scene of her walking out to her old house and being inspired to make art for the past once again. She pretends like they were only stories, even though I think she knows full well that they were more than that. Part of me thinks that it might have been unintentional at first. Edie says it herself. In the attempt to reclaim the past, she lost her way and ended up hurting her family. She only found clarity in that harm, and we can see that with subtle references like the deer that killed Sam and Gregory's crib. And finally, Edith's death shows us that Edie's attempt to keep her stories alive after she died was successful. We don't know how Edith died exactly, but I don't think it really matters. What matters is that she was just another cog in Edie's story machine, and she simply didn't have the foresight to change that. There was never a curse in What Remains of Edith Finch. Simply a collection of horror stories that they all believed were real. And that finally brings us to the end of this video. I do really hope you enjoy it, and I hope my explanation did this game any amount of justice. This is the time in the video where I finally admit why I love and sort of hate this game so much. My own mother died about a year ago from this video in a very similar way to Dawn. She was sick most of her life, and her being in a hospital was a weekly occurrence. It took me weeks to really acknowledge it because I was so used to her being absent. That line of she got better for a while and then she didn't is all too real for me. I never got to say goodbye to my mom before she died. The last time we spoke was a conversation about how my car needed to go to the shop because of some faulty brakes. I didn't want to bring this up in the video, really, as it doesn't really relate to the game all that much, but it certainly hit me pretty hard when hearing about Dawn's death. Anyways, on that miserable note, I hope you enjoyed the video. Remember to comment your ideas and theories down below, as I'd love to hear what you have to say. Thank you to our members who have access to a whole catalog of exclusive videos, and thank you again for watching. Bye-bye.